Đây, chạy đây. Ok miền.
Được.
Everything it needs to install Atom on your system.
Cái đoạn đầu
So
nói chi nhỉ?
once you're done, it
Này là nói là cài Chrome với lại Atom IDE.
Xua đi đoạn này dùng đâu, đoạn này mình cần đâu.
should open up a. You'll see that install it. So this is where I've
Cài
got
mấy
the
cái
Now,
extension.
similar to the packages and you'll
Cái này là tip tip học thôi, không có gì đâu. Gì vậy?
Khóa này học bao nhiêu? Học bao nhiêu buổi?
Nó tính theo tiếng mà. Đây này.
Tổng là bao nhiêu tiếng?
Đây là 42 phút nha. Cái này 1 giờ 19 phút nha. Cái này 50 phút này 1 giờ 1 tiếng rưỡi nha. Hình như là tổng là 5 mấy tiếng phải.
Đấy luôn, nhiều quá. Ok, chạy.
they all have a single purpose, and that's to
Ok. Tao tưởng
interpret
mất.
your files, such as your HTML files, your CSS files, your JavaScript files, into a website that should be displayed. For example, we've got a little bit of HTML code here that says that our website should have a title
Cái này là giới thiệu về HTML nhá.
called hello, and in the body, there should be a heading that says hello world. So if we pass that code into our browser, it will open it and display it like so, with the title of the website usually on the tab bar, and that H1 or that big heading showing up in the body of our website. So before we dive deep into this, it's really important to remember that HTML is the foundation of all websites. So, for example, you won't see websites that are created using just a CSS file or just a JavaScript file, but you can create websites using just an HTML file. Now, it might not look great. It'll probably look like it came from the 90s, but it does enable your website to display text or various elements such as images or forms or tables, depending on how you code up the HTML file. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And the really important part here is the word markup, because there's many markup languages. For example, you might have heard of things such as XML, Extensible Markup Language,
Markup là gì
or
đâu?
GML, Generalized.
Là cái HTML nó không phải là ngôn ngữ để lập trình, nó là ngôn ngữ để viết ra thôi, hiểu không?
Mày cứ chạy tao hỏi ấy mà.
Markup language.
Cái gì? Đúng rồi. Cho nên là Hypertext Markup Language tức là cái ngôn ngữ markup mà dùng Hypertext ấy, thì là dùng chủ yếu ở trên internet kiểu thế.
Hypertext là siêu văn bản.
Thì ai chả biết. Nó là sau này mà học gọi là đường truyền các thứ ấy thì là Hypertext là nó là cái mà được ưu tiên nhất khi mà chuyển giao dữ liệu giữa các máy chủ ấy.
Ê, mày cho to tiếng cái phần mềm ấy nữa không? Tao cứ phải chỉnh mic.
Sao cái gì ấy?
To tiếng cái mày đang xem được không?
To hết cỡ rồi.
Cứ thấy nhỏ.
Tổ chim thì nó nhỏ rồi.
Chạy đi.
Mày chỉnh được tiếng stream mà. Chỉnh tiếng stream đi.
Chỉnh cái gì?
Mày bấm vào cái ô stream trên Discord đây.
À đây, đúng rồi. Ok. Ok. Okay.
And all of these languages share a common history. They're based off the markup that used to be put into manuscripts, where editors would mark up the manuscript and either specify changes to the author or specify structure and layout to the publishers. So for example, you might have the squiggly line that shows the publishers that this part should be printed in bold or this part should be printed in italics. And HTML works in much the same way. You can specify the layout and structure of your website by using HTML tags. So if you head over to your browser and go to a website called codepen.io, then we can have a look and have a play around with real live HTML. So you don't have to sign up, just head over to codepen.io and then hit create new pen. And then we're going to change the view to a format like this. So this is the live version of our website. And these are the places where we're going to put our code. So as you can see, CodePen lets you put in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which will together get interpreted and get shown on the left as your website. Now, as we're only working with HTML at the moment, I'm going to minimize the CSS and JavaScript sections, and I'm just going to work from the HTML section. Now, we're going to need some text to work with, or to have something which we can give structure to. If you head over to gutenberg.org/ebook/1661, you get taken to The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. So one of my favorite books of all time. If you have a look down here, you can see that you can view the book as plain text, or you can read this book online as HTML. So this is what the plain text looks like. It has all of the text in the book, but absolutely no structure. But when we have a look at the HTML file, you can see that it has laid out the book with a structure that is more human readable. And this is what we're going to replicate using HTML. So if you go ahead and just copy this part, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and you copy it and place it into your pen. So in the HTML section here. Now, you can see that all of this text gets put onto the screen with absolutely no structure. And in order for this to start looking like this, we're going to start adding a little bit of HTML. So the first thing we can see is that this is the largest heading on the page. So we can make our website look like that also by adding an H1 tag into our HTML. So the tags start with angular brackets and end with angular brackets, and in the middle is the type of element or the type of tag you want to use. Now, it's really important that when you open tags that you should also close them, because as you can see here, I've got an open tag, but I have yet to close it, and it thinks that the entire content
Ok.
Để push to talk đi. Lúc nào bấm thì là nói. Bấm cái nút, cài cái nút nào đấy.
contents of my page should be made into the largest heading possible. And that's not what I want. I only want it for this section, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So in order to close the tag, it's the same angle brackets, but then I have to use a / and then write H1. So now only this part is an H1 or a large heading. Now, if we have a look at the other parts, I would say that this word by is a little bit smaller than the author name. So let's structure this as a heading also, but let's make it a subtitle. So let's make it a slightly smaller heading. And to do that, we can simply wrap this text around an H2 tag. And now we have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as a heading, but in a smaller size and shown with less importance than the big title. So now, finally, we have this word by. And I reckon that's one size smaller than this head.
Nhấn thì nó ở đâu á? Nhấn đánh nút gì? Điều chỉnh nút
Mày
ở đâu?
tự cài, nút đấy mày tự cài.
Ở đâu?
Đây này, nhìn nha. Đây Discord đúng không?
Ông mày chưa chuyển sang Discord.
Đây. Đúng rồi, tao đang share mình cái đấy rồi.
Ông cài đặt người dùng à? Đâu nữa?
Đây, thấy chưa? Cài đặt người dùng này, đây này. Xong rồi voice and video này. Rồi để push to talk này. Đây voice and video này, ở dưới này.
Rồi. Hello, rồi, sao nữa?
Tao vừa bấm vào push to talk nên là nó không nói được ấy.
Mày không nhìn thấy cái của mày.
Hả?
Không nhìn thấy được của mày đâu. Bấm nhấn để nói rồi, xong sao nữa? Cài cái nút ở đâu?
Cái nút ở ngay ở dưới đó mà. Alo, alo. Anh đang gửi trên Messenger ấy.
Alo, nghe nói chi không?
Nghe. Được rồi đấy, được rồi.
Đi mẹ nó không cho cài MB5.
MB5 là cái gì?
Cái nút bên con chuột ấy.
Tại nút thằng Minh có nhiều nút hơn. Được chưa? Tiếp tục nhá. Alo.
Heading. So let's go ahead and wrap this inside an H3. I hope you're starting to get the gist. The heading tags get smaller as the number goes up. So
Sao? Đây.
Tao vào lại. Ok, vào đi.
for example, if I change this to an H4, it gets even smaller, H5, smaller still, and all the way until H6, which is the smallest font size for the heading element. Now, if you keep going to H7, you'll notice that it doesn't do anything anymore. It doesn't change the heading size. And that's because the heading elements only go from H1 to H6. Now, how do I know that, I hear you ask? So this is a good point in the course to introduce documentation. And the reason why I'm talking about it so early on is because of how important it is to your journey as a web developer. So one of the key skills in becoming a great web developer, or in fact any sort of programmer, is getting good at finding out how you can help yourself. And a lot of that involves getting good at Googling.
Đấy, tóm lại là muốn làm web dev giỏi thì phải Google giỏi, phải Skid giỏi.
How do you find the specific piece of information that's going to help you achieve what it is that you want, or help you understand what it is that you want to know? So in this case, we're talking about headings, and we are using HTML. And I'm going to add in the name of the documentation that I prefer to use, which is MDN, and it stands for the Mozilla Developer Network. So the same people who made Firefox, for example. So if I go ahead and hit enter, you see a whole bunch of results come up. And the most relevant for us is the H1 to H6, and it talks about headings. So if we click on that, you can learn more about the heading elements used in HTML. And they even have example code snippets that show you what it would look like rendered in a browser. Now, there's a couple of sources for documentation. One is, of course, MDN. Another one is called W3 Schools. So let's see if we try W3 Schools with HTML, and we're talking about headings, right? Let's see what we get here. So HTML headings is the first result that comes up. And similarly, you've got the code examples, you've got the results, and you've got a little bit of notes that tell you how you should be using your headings. Both of these places have a lot of really useful usage notes, and it's worth reading through when you're first coming across a particular element. That way, you'll have a good foundation of knowledge when you start to build and create your own websites. So I want to show you one last resource that I quite like using, which is called devdocs.io. And this is basically a website that puts together a lot of the useful documentation in a structure that I find to be quite handy. So if we have a look inside the HTML5 tab, and we go into the elements, we can see that there's a total of 135 elements. And if you scroll down, you can see that we've got H1 through to H6. And if you click on any of these, then it brings up actually the MDN documentation. So you can see that it's similar to what we saw in MDN, but it's just structured in a very simple way, and it's very easy to follow. So that's definitely a website that's worth bookmarking. So if we head back over to our HTML file, we're going to
Một tí nhá. Cái dev doc đấy thì nên tải về xài luôn. Đây này. Tao có tải về đây này. Đây.
Mày không
Đấy.
xem màn hình ngoài, mày chỉ xem màn hình cái ấy thôi.
Đây à? Alo. Ở đâu nha? Đây. Đây này. Tao có tải về đây này. Khi nào code thì lôi lên search. Search debug thì lên mạng search, còn search mấy cái thuật toán các thứ thì là vào đây có hết. Đấy. Nên là khá là tiện. Có đủ hết mày. Đây. Có cả Angular này. Angular nó là framework nha. Đây là mấy cái cơ bản nha. Đây này, mấy cái ngôn ngữ cơ bản này. Xong rồi C cộng cộng này. Mấy cái này là framework hết này. Git này. Có cả mấy dòng lệnh git này. Nói chung là đây, search đây này. Nốt. Đấy, có nốt luôn này. Thì sáp. Này. Đấy. Có thì lên Google thôi.
Change that back to an H3, which is an HTML tag that actually exists, as opposed to something like H9. So the next thing that we need to do in order to better replicate this website is to add some space between these lines. Now in a word processor
Tại sao đây?
Đây tao vào bằng web thì mày cứ chuyển sang là tao không nhìn được.
Phải.
such as Word or Google
Cái gì?
Docs, you'll be able to simply just hit enter a few times or hit return a few times and get that spacing show up.
Mày cài đặt cái
Now,
gì
unfortunately, in
Hả?
từ lúc mày bấm đến giờ, từ lúc mày bấm tab ra đến giờ tao không nhìn thấy gì cả.
What? Đức có nhìn thấy không Đức?
Thì mẹ hay máy tao bị sao nhỉ?
Để tắt đi lại xem nào.
Chắc do mạng người ta rồi. Mẹ ăn.
Được chưa?
Thôi mày cứ xem đi, Đức lưu lại xe cho tao nhé.
Phải cứ
Tao đang xem mà, có thể xem được đâu, nó cứ loát đấy.
nó là do mạng mày rồi. Nó có mấy cái chấm chấm đúng không?
Ba chấm cứ chạy ấy.
Đúng rồi, do mạng đấy. Phải áp đi đúng không?
Tao dùng app, bây giờ tao dùng app này, dùng app mà không được, tao dùng web không được, chuyển sang app không được mà.
Do mạng.
Mày cứ xem đi.
Thôi. Em tí lưu record lại.
HTML, it doesn't quite work like that. It's a little bit more complicated. In order to create that spacing, we actually have to use an HTML element called a line break, and it's written like so. And the interesting thing about this HTML element is that it doesn't require both an open and a close tag. So when we had the H1 through to H6 tags, you can see that we started out by marking the text with an H1 and then we closed it off with a closing tag. But the line break element works all by itself, and you can even put it inside like so to make this part go onto a new line. Now, this is a good time point to review the anatomy of HTML tags. All right, so let's talk about the anatomy of an HTML tag and break it down to its component parts so that we can actually understand how they're structured and how we can use them. So we've written HTML elements like so. So here we have the words hello world, and they're enclosed by an opening tag and a closing tag. And in between those tags is the content that we want to apply that structure to. So if you think back to the days of marking down a manuscript, it's exactly the same as putting down a squiggly line underneath certain words or phrases and asking the publisher to make it bolded to affect the structure of certain parts of the text. Now, in this case, the publisher just happens to be our browser. So these tags make requests to the browser, asking it to structure and display our plain text in the way that the web designer wanted it to be shown. Now,
Hiểu không? Alo, hiểu không? Tức là markup language tức là đánh dấu ấy. Ngày xưa thì người ta đánh dấu giống kiểu chữ này để cho nhà xuất bản họ bôi đen ấy, thì bây giờ là mình đánh dấu để cho cái browser nó bôi đen, hiểu không?
The other type of tag that we just saw are tags that don't have a closing tag. They're expressed simply like so. And these are called self-closing tags. And we've seen that with the break tag, and there's a few more others that work like this also. Now, how do we find out if something requires a closing tag or is self-closing? Well, this is where we head to the documentation again. So if we have a look at the documentation for the heading elements, you can see that there's this part in the table that says tag omission, and it says that both the starting and ending tags are mandatory, so that you can specify which portion of your text you want to apply this structure to. Now, if we have a look at the BR or the line break element, you can see that under tag omission, it says that it must have a start tag and must not have an end tag. So this is how we find out how we write our tags. Now, while we're here, I want to introduce you to another element called the horizontal rule, or the HR tag. And this will allow us to create these horizontal lines above and below our portion of text. So as you can see in the documentation, under tag omission, it also says that it must not have an end tag. So this is also a self-closing tag. Let's head back over to our pen so that we can add these two horizontal rules above and below our text. So the first one is going to go here, and the last one is going to go here. You can see that our web page now has two horizontal lines above and below our main portion of text. Now, if we have a closer look at this website, you can see that their horizontal rule is a little bit thicker than ours. So how can we make ours look more like theirs? Now, this is the part where I show you a neat trick. On any web page that you open in Chrome, you can simply right-click on the element that you're interested in and click Inspect in order to look at the HTML and CSS code that's being rendered in the background by the browser. So you can see here, they've got an HR element, horizontal rule, but they've got also all of this going on afterwards. What exactly is that? Now, we know that the first part of the tag is the HTML element, and it's BR or HR, whatever it is that you want to use. Now, the second part inside the angle bracket or inside our tag is new, and this is called an HTML attribute, and it basically gives more information to the browser to specify modifications to that HTML element. So in this case, we're saying that we want a horizontal rule, but we want it in size 3. Now, what does size 3 mean? And how do we know that we have these HTML attributes available to us? You've guessed it, we're going back to the documentation. Now, I know I'm making a big deal about going to the documentation, but it really is an important skill. Understanding and being able to look up the documentation, being familiar with the structure of it and where to look in order to find out how to implement or do certain things. If we have a look at our documentation for HR, you can see that there's this section called attributes, and that's what we spoke about just now. The attribute comes after the main HTML element and is separated from the element by a single space. In this case, the horizontal rule element has actually quite a few attributes, including a line. So you can specify whether if you want your horizontal line to align to the left or align to the right or be centered. You can specify the color of the horizontal rule. You can set whether if you want the horizontal rule to have shading or not. And you can also set the height in pixels of that horizontal rule, which is what we saw earlier on over here. So in this case, the reason why their horizontal rule looks different to ours is because ours is by default only 1 pixel high or 1 pixel in size, whereas theirs, if you inspect in the
Element á, alignment á. Align là căn lề ấy, ví dụ nếu mà cái gọi là gì nhỉ? Cái đường gạch ngang đấy mày muốn xếp nó ở bên trái bên phải ở giữa. Nếu mà nó nhỏ hơn cái màn hình ấy, hiểu không?
HTML is 3 pixels in height, and they've also specified no shade, i.e. no shading to the horizontal rule. So if we want to make our website a seamless copy of what we see here, then we also have to specify those attributes. So if you remember, the horizontal rule is a self-closing tag. And so inside the tag, we're going to make a space, and then we're going to specify the name of the attribute, which we know from the documentation to be called the size attribute. And we're going to set it to equal 3 pixels. And then we're going to specify that it is no shade, i.e. no shading. And we know all of this from the documentation. So now, once our code updates, you can see that this brand new horizontal rule looks completely different from what it was before, and we can copy this over to the top as well, so that our horizontal rules look exactly the same as what we've got over here. So now we've seen HTML elements that require an opening tag as well as a closing tag. We've also seen HTML elements that have a self-closing tag. And finally, we've seen that HTML elements can also have an attribute where you can specify modifications to the default element. Now, all we need is just to add one final tag called center to our HTML file, and we would have now faithfully copied what this website looks like. So you can have a look through the HTML by, remember, right-clicking and inspecting in Chrome, and you can look through to see how they've structured the rest of the document as well. Now, this is a good point to mention our first challenge. So we've got this code pen now where we've been messing around with the HTML. Now, you can either save this anonymously, or you can create a free account in CodePen in order to be able to access this later on. But I want you to create a brand new pen. And this pen is going to be our code playbook. And you're going to use this document as an interactive notebook, if you will. And I want you to document here all the new things that you've learned as we progress through the course. For example, in this and the last lesson, we learn about the H1 tag. So in our code playbook, the first thing that's going to go in is your H1 tag. And you can say that this is a level 1 heading created using the H1 tag. We can go ahead and close it off. And you can look through the documentation to perhaps copy some of these code snippets over, but make sure that whenever you're copying, pasting code, that you understand what the code does. There's nothing worse than copy and pasting code that breaks your website because you didn't understand what you've put in there. So we can go ahead and then modify each of these so that when we're creating our own websites and we want to come back to our playbook and have it as a point of reference, then we'll be able to see easily at a glance all of the elements that we've used and that we've learned about before. So my challenge to you is to create your very own code playbook and to start keeping notes on all the things that you're learning in this course. Now, sometimes with certain elements, for example, the line break, you won't be able to put any text inside the line break in the same way that we've done so for the H1 tag. this is a point where you can use a comment instead in your HTML file. Comments are portions of text which are marked out to be ignored by the browser. And they're usually places where you write notes to yourself or notes to fellow programmers who might be looking at your code. So in HTML, we create a comment by using the angle bracket, a exclamation mark, 2 dashes, and then to close off the comment, we use another 2 dashes and a closing angle bracket. And everything in between here is a comment. You can see that usually it gets highlighted in a different color, and none of it gets interpreted into the web page. So this is where you can put sections for your notes. For example, self-closing tags. You can make it into several paragraphs just by putting the closing tag at the bottom, and you can write notes on the elements as we come across them and keep this for your own reference. By the time when you're ready to create your own website, it will be a goldmine of a resource to jog your memory on all of the lessons that you've learned. So in the next lesson, we're going to be building our very first website. And it's going to be really, really awesome because we're going to be using a real text editor and we're going to be putting that website live onto the internet. So there's all of that and more yet to come. So I will see you on the next lesson. All right, so in
Bà học có thực hành không Đức? Học có thực hành không? Có thì pause lại.
In this lesson, we're going to be building our very first website. Now, because we've only talked about HTML so far, so how to structure websites using HTML elements, and we haven't yet gotten to the part where we've learned about styling using CSS, then we're kind of limited in terms of the kind of websites that we can make. But fear not. Our websites are going to be right up there with the internet titans, but just way back in 1997. So do you remember what Yahoo looked like when it first launched? Or do you remember what Google looked like when it first came out? No? Don't remember? Well, there's a great website that can show you exactly that. And it's called the Internet Archive Wayback Machine. And you can find it at web.archive.org. Now in here, if you just enter the URL of a website that you're interested in, say yahoo.com, then it shows you what this website looks like all the way from 1996 to current day, which is 2017. Now let's have a look at what Yahoo looked like originally on the first day it was crawled, so 17th of October, 1996. So let's go ahead and click on that snapshot. And this is exactly what it looks like. So if we close off this frame, you can see it's almost like as if you've time traveled back to 1996 when Yahoo first launched and you were visiting this website for the first time. Now, as you can see, most of this is just pure HTML. It's a lot of structure and a lot of formatting, but it looks really ugly. But it's okay because it's a great place to get started with. This is the sort of website that we're going to be building by the end of this module. Now, I hear you say, oh, but this looks terrible. Surely nobody builds websites like this anymore. Well, this is an interesting anecdote that you might not know. If you have a look at some of the world's top computer science professors and you look at their...
Yeah. Ê, cái gì vừa xảy ra đây? Tự nhiên thấy tiếng trên Discord.
personal pages that they've built, they all look a little bit like this, not so dissimilar from the websites in 1996. So this is Thomas Corman, who's a serious algorithm guy, and this is a website of John Kleinberg, another huge name computer science professor, and of course the king himself, Donald Knuth, has a website that looks like this. So if it's good enough for these computer science titans, then it's probably good enough also for our very first website. By the end of this module, we're going to build a website that looks much like this. Something that we can put up online to show what we've done, our CV, as well as our hobbies and things that we like to do. So you can use it as a personal site or somewhere to list your CV online. I hope you're excited because I'm super excited. And once you're ready, let's go ahead and create our very first website. Now, once you're ready, go ahead and open up the Atom editor. Now, if you haven't yet installed Atom, this is a good point to go back and have a look at those videos on how to install Atom for Mac or for Windows. Because from here on out, we're going to be working with the Atom editor to create every single one of our websites. So it's really, really important that you have it set up with all the packages that we've specified in those installation videos. But once you've got it installed and opened, you should be looking at a screen like this. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to File and we're going to open a new project folder to work out of. So I want you to create a new folder, either in your desktop or somewhere else that you prefer, and it's going to be called Web Development. Go ahead and hit Create, and then select that web development folder and go ahead and click Open. And now you'll see your project folder show up in the sidebar over here, and you can toggle it closed by clicking on that arrow button over there. So now that we've got our web development folder, this is where we're going to store all of our projects. The first project that we're going to be creating is our personal website. So go ahead and right click on the web development folder, and we're going to create a new folder inside the web development folder. And we're going to call our project HTML personal site. And now we're ready to create our very first HTML file inside this folder. So again, right click on this tab, and we're going to create a new file. Now, as you get used to Atom, you're going to start to want to use some of their shortcuts. So for example, instead of right-clicking and selecting new file, you can also just simply select the HTML personal site and hit A in order to do the same thing. But in the beginning, as you're getting used to Atom, I'm going to be using a lot of the mouse controls so that you can see what's happening on screen. But feel free to start incorporating the shortcuts into your workflow. And as time goes on, you'll find that they make life so much quicker and so much easier. So now we're going to create our very first file. And you can see the way that the files are structured is that we're creating it inside this folder called HTML personal site. And inside that folder is where our web page is going to be located. Let's go ahead and create this home page. And by convention, we're going to name it index.html. And that is usually the name that developers will give their home page. So go ahead and hit enter in order to create that file. And if you open up this folder, you can see that's exactly where it's located. And it should open up on the right hand or the main pane over here as well. Now, in order to create any HTML website, there's a little bit of boilerplate code that's associated. Now, you can either write it all out, or because we installed the Emmet plugin, we can simply write HTML and then hit enter, and it will insert all of that boilerplate code for us. Now, if that didn't work for you, you could also hit the tab key after writing HTML or typing an exclamation mark and then hitting the tab or the enter key. Try some of these combinations that you see on screen.
Có MS mà, ví dụ có MS mà. Có chứ, thì mày không thì code kiểu gì? Tự code à? Ý là mày bấm một chữ là nó ra cái mày định bấm ấy. Đúng rồi, phải thế chứ. Đây. Xe luôn. Có làm thì làm luôn đi, đây này, nhìn nào, nhìn thấy không? Alo, đây nha. Đó. HTML5. Đây, MS này, thấy MS nào? Đó. Đây. HTML kia là một cái tab bình thường rồi. Này. Còn HTML5 là nó là kiểu mẫu cho mày luôn đấy. Có thực hành thì thực hành luôn đi, tạo các thứ đây này, tạo cái này hôm trước tao học qua